happy again, kind of with security. Performance is another thing that I really would love to see further to the left. So really happy to have Gopal here today. And let's see what you got for us.
Thank you. As you can read, my name is Gopal, and I'm going to talk about performance engineering in Agile and DevOps. Currently, I work at a company called SoFi. We are an online financial services company. Previous to that, I worked at SAP Concur. I'm sure most of you have probably used it. Before that, I worked at Nordstrom. And before that, a bunch of other places. But it's kind of fun coming here because it's kind of like a reunion between with a lot of my old comrades at Concur and Nordstrom, and a lot of great vendors and stuff. So it's pretty fun. A little bit more about me. Before getting into IT, I was in nuclear physics. I worked on some interesting experiments looking for solar neutrinos in Japan and some particle accelerator experiments in Europe and national laboratories here in the United States, studying the Big Bang and looking for the quark-gluon plasma. Outside of IT, I have a farm where I grow a lot of fruits and vegetables and make jams and preserves and pickles and kombucha and raise ducks. And in my spare time, I have a woodworking business where I make things like this puzzle, toys, furniture, home decor items, and sell those online and at craft fairs. So I don't know if I found that elevator job that Jeff was talking about yesterday, but I certainly keep busy and have a lot of fun. So when we think about how we approach performance engineering traditionally, it's pretty standard. Design, build, functional test. If everything actually works, then maybe you do the performance testing, and then you deploy to production. Oops. Or maybe you design, you build, you functional test, you deploy to production, and then you realize, oh, I have a performance problem. Maybe I should do some testing. So there's a lot of technical challenges, in this approach to performance testing. Environments are performance testing environments are very, very difficult to build and maintain and keep that parity with production. Data, the volumes of data that you need to do performance testing are quite high. The data models are very complex. Trying to match all that customer type information or the account information is a real challenge. And then, of course, you need automated scripts to simulate that workload, and that's just a never-ending struggle or almost like a hamster wheel of trying to keep those up to date. And what all this means then is that you end up spending a lot of time and a lot of money maintaining this performance test environment and then executing those tests. And because of all these problems, you have a lot of questions around the reliability. Can you even trust the results? Do they tell you anything useful? And there's not only just the technical challenges, it's also that sort of fundamental mental approach of we're trying to, in this methodology, we're essentially trying to test performance into the application, right? And that's probably the most expensive, least effective way to do that. So we have to change how we think about performance. And usually people classify performance as a non-functional requirement. And the whole definition or the whole categorization there, I kind of find odd, because what does non-functional means? It means it does not work. Or in this case, it usually means nobody works on it. And it certainly doesn't work for the customer. So don't think about performance as a non-functional requirement. Think of it as a feature. And why should you think of it as a feature? That's because performance matters to your customer, and so it matters to your business, right? If you're in e-commerce, then you know that your conversion rates, which is the amount you sell, are directly impacted by the performance or the page load times. The slower you are, the less your customers buy. even if you're not in e-commerce, there's, your customers are going to be severely affected and impacted by the performance, right? Like we heard earlier, like who likes a slow website? I do, because it's kind of fun, but it keeps me busy. But anyway, the bottom line is it's important to your business, it's important to your customers. And so when we think of about performance as a feature, then really, we all have responsibility for performance. It's not just something that that performance engineering team thinks about. It's not just something that the operations or the DevOps team thinks about. It's something that we all need to think about. And so we need to think about it early, often, and everywhere, right? At all points during the product lifecycle or the SDLC or whatever you want to talk about it, we need to be thinking about performance. And so what does that look like? Well, even at the business level, at the marketing level, at the advertising level, performance is impactful. You think about the business wants to grow, and so that means that you need to scale this. You need to scale out your systems to support that, right? You're going to have new product launches that the business is really concerned about. Again, you need to understand how those new products are going to perform before they get in front of the customers. And so these are things the business wants to talk about. And then, of course, marketing campaigns can drive a lot of traffic, at a site. So one of my previous jobs, we had a very good understanding of what our peak capabilities were. And I was working with the marketing team, and they had this really great marketing plan to send out millions and millions of emails, and everyone was going to click on it, and they were going to all go to this exact same page. Right? And so I won't tell the long story. Those of you who worked with me at Nordstrom know how badly that can go. But we learned from that, and so I worked with the marketing team to understand those campaigns. And when they said, "Oh yeah, we're going to have all these millions of emails," and we're like, "Well, what's the click-through rate?" And they said, "Well, it's going to be very successful." I said, "Well, if it's as successful as you want, it will crash the site." And nobody wanted that, and so I asked them, just flat out, like, well, what if we spread it out over a few hours? Is that going to affect anything? They're like, no, that's fine. Like, okay, well, that's great, because then we know we're fully confident that our site can support it, and we can get the campaign out, right? So, again, that's something you can't really test into your site, but you want to work as far left as you possibly can. And then you get a little bit more into technical planning, thinking about requirements. You can start thinking about your SLAs and your service level agreements. How fast do you need to be? And people will often say, well, the business sets the SLAs, right? Well, I remember working on a site, and there was a new feature being added to a page, and it was going to increase the site response time by half a second. And so we said, no go. No go. You can't put it into production. And the product manager said, well, why can't we go? And I said, well, it's too slow. It's a half second too slow. The product manager said, that's okay. I'm okay with that. Just launch. Hit the date. Hit the date. Just launch. I'm okay. Half second's not that bad. He said, no. It's beyond. Yes, it's a true story. I said, no. It's above the SLA. We can't launch. And he said, well, I'm the product manager. I'm okay. Anyway, who are you? Who are you to say, what the SLA is and what and who do you set it? And I said, and I showed. I said, you're right. I'm nobody. I don't set the SLA. And then I showed the graph, the actual graph for our company. You see, this is where we're at, and if we add a half second, we're going to lose millions of dollars. And and who's setting that? This is our customers telling us, right? This is not me. This is not my team. These are the customers telling us that this is, it's an unacceptable performance if we add a half second. So anyway, you can go if you want. So, think about that when you're planning what your SLAs are. Think about what types of workloads you need, and think about observability, right? Like, it's not just, oh, we have a problem in production, and now we need to figure out what's going on, so we need some metrics, and we need some logging. What do we need to do, right? Start thinking about when you're planning, what is your system for doing it? What type of tools you're going to use, and what do you need to, what type of information do you need to collect? And when you get into the Agile process, a lot of times, especially new organizations are going through an Agile transformation. Say, well, performance cannot be done in Agile. But there's a lot of things that the performance engineering team needs to do. And if you want to make it very visible, go ahead and create performance stories and tasks, right as part of your sprint planning process. If you're using Jira, just go ahead and do it. And that helps to get the visibility into it, right, and helps with the planning. So it's not just, oh, what do you mean we need to do performance testing, or we need to write scripts, or we need to update the workload model, right? These are all things that need to be done, and they should be done as just integrated completely into your Agile process. Another thing too, add it to your definition of done. Right, a lot of times teams struggle with, well, when are we done? And that's, I think, a really great thing in Agile. You can just define it. And so even I was working with a team, and they said, Gopal, you're like a great visionary, but we're not anywhere near where we can do that. And I said, well, yes, you need to do it, but we can start small. And so what we did was we just said, okay, I want your definition of done to be you've actually evaluated every single story for performance impact, right? Just think about performance, and that can be your definition of done. And so they said, well, okay, we can handle that. And so I just worked with the Jira admins, and we just added a little checkbox, right into the Jira story to say, like, has this story, did anyone think about performance when they were working on this story, right? And that, gets you very far along, right? To just think about performance, make it part of your standard process. And it's never too early to think about the metrics and the monitoring dashboards that you need, because you're dev, but ops, right? So you've got to think about the operation. So think about it, very early, and go ahead and create those stories. So, I was working with teams, and we actually had dashboards up and running in production before we actually had the code. So they were totally blank, but they were completely written. And then as soon as the code deployed, those dashboards were populated, and we knew exactly how their code was performing. And then as you go into the design stage, you can think about scalability and performance, during design. And sometimes a lot of times it's just very simple things. Like I can't even keep track of how many times, in performance testing we realized that developers had just left the standard timeout to be like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 3 minutes. Right, and we'd realize, why are all these threads just sitting around doing something when something fails, doing nothing when something fails? Like, well, they weren't even setting things like timeouts, So think about when you're designing, design for that resiliency, so you can handle things like when services fail. And definitely think about testability. I firmly believe that another requirement for software should be it's easy to test. So a lot of automated tests and scripts, they kind of interact with an application in kind of a weird way. And it's very common that a change will be made, it's deployed, and then all of a sudden all the automated scripts break. Right, and now the testers are scrambling to figure out why did it break, and they have to redo all their scripting and figure out what changed. Well, think about that when you're actually designing your software. Make it easy to test. And especially I'm a big fan of testing in production. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But there's all sorts of challenges. People say, well, we can't test in production because X, Y, and Z. But if you actually designed your code and designed your systems to enable it to test in production, it would be very easy. And actually at Nordstrom, we were able to make code modifications to support our testing in production. And then you get to the build phase. And again, now, hopefully you've done a really great job in design, and so now the coding or the building is just implementing that design. But again, think about observability. So I've worked on sites where every page or every function or service essentially has the same name. And so when you look in the logs, it looks like the users just hit the same page over and over and over again. And when you try to debug it, or troubleshoot, it's impossible because you really have like no clue what the users are doing and what's happening in the system. So, just do things like, give good names, make it very obvious what's happening. So when you're looking at your logging or you're using your APM tool, it's very clear. And again, make sure you code for resiliency. One time, a funny story, we deployed a new page, and all of a sudden it just increased by by about like 3 seconds, and it was like, well, that's weird. Why is it just across the board 3 seconds higher? And after digging and digging and digging, we realized that the developer had, instead of putting a timeout for 3 seconds, they put a wait for 3 seconds. So that was a very easy fix. And of course, once you start doing CI and CD, you wanna try to get some testing as part of that pipeline, right? You want to shift left and test early. And again, these are not like huge giant performance tests where you're trying to simulate Cyber Monday. Quick tests. Quick small tasks depending on what type of infrastructure you have as part of your pipeline. But what you can still do, no matter what, you can establish baselines of your response time. You can test over and over again, and you can compare that and see how they're trending. And you can also track things, not just response time, but things like service calls or database calls. Because these are things that are independent of the environment. They're more around the architecture and the design, but they have a huge impact later on, right? So if you can find something like, oh, a service, all of a sudden now is calling the database 10 times more than it did, for each invocation. Well, when you get into production, that's going to be 10 times more load on your servers, on your database servers. And so you can find things like that and prevent them. So trying to find these sort of small things can have big effects here. And you can catch the small things that have, you catch the big things that have effects, later on. So again, think about performance, not just about testing, but about this performance engineering from, all the way from start to finish. And if you're testing in CI/CD, you really want to think about building a nice framework. And there's a lot of open source tools and vendor tools that you can use to do all of this. These are just some of the components. But it's really about making things very easy to script, to execute those tests, and monitor the results, and then get that analysis so you can make that decision that, go, no go, or pass, fail as part of your pipeline. And then, of course, we get to the lab type load and stress testing. And this is where now you can focus on, looking at growth projections. The business wants to grow 4 or 5 times over the year. You can test that in the lab. And of course, peak loads like a Cyber Monday or a big sale or a big marketing campaign or, like a Super Bowl type thing. And in the lab, it's also really good for testing for endurance and stability, right? Do you have memory leaks? Is your site going to stay up over the entire span of a Cyber Monday where you're just under intense load all day? And here, too, you want to do what I would consider full analysis. So, in a pipeline or in a small test, you can just kind of you're just looking at the counts, you're looking at the response times, and you're just comparing them. Are they getting bigger? Are they getting smaller? But here you want to, really look at your code and your design. And it's, again, you're not trying to test performance in, but it's more of verification and evaluation and looking for optimizations. And so the APM tools, all the vendors are here. They are very good at giving you really deep insight into how your code is performing and how your system is designed. And even if everything looks good, you meet your objectives, you can still look and see like, well, these services, the way these services interact or the way this caching is implemented is not maybe optimal, and you can make things better. And then, beyond the lab, think about testing in production. And there's a lot of different types you can do, a lot of different types of testing in production you can do. There's things like, A/B testing, canary testing can be very effective, especially in terms of mitigating that risk. Just, do a soft launch and slowly ramp up. With controlled conditions, and you can see. Again, it's verification. Hopefully, you're fairly confident, but when there's high risk involved, there's a new technology being deployed. It's a good idea. And you can also just run full-scale synthetic load testing. So I've been at places where I remember the first time I suggested, well, why don't we do performance testing in production? And some of the development directors looked at me and like I was crazy. And I thought they were just going to fire me right there on the spot. We're like, you've totally lost it. We can't even believe anything you're saying. But eventually we worked up to a point where we were doing full-scale Cyber Monday loads once a week in production. And there's a lot of different ways you can do it. Do you remember? We were doing it. And again, that's too where we did make a lot of modifications in the code so we could identify our test users and handle them appropriately, avoid credit card charges, avoid credit checks, kind of do all that stuff. And we literally put code into our production site whose only purpose was to enable testing. And we actually did find issues which we could not find anywhere else, because no matter how much effort you spend, in testing, in pre-production testing, you are never going to be able to cover everything, right? Your test environment is not going to match. You're not going to be able to do 100% of what your users are going to do. And so you want to talk about. And so, while you cannot test everything, you should monitor everything, right? There's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't be monitoring everything that's happening in your system. And again, this is now just a continuation of performance engineering. It doesn't end at test. And you want to understand, what that customer experience is and what the business relevance is. So if you're e-commerce, you really want to know, how your product search is going, how your product page is launching, how is your checkout process going, how are your expense reports going, if you're in another type of business line. Focus, understand what are the important metrics to that. You can create dashboards, you can create alerts, and then I always joke, you create a dashboard, you create an alert, then you create a rule in your inbox to delete your alerts. I didn't put that up, but I should. So, so there's a lot of promising applications of machine learning to avoid that alert overload and the dashboard overload. I've probably created hundreds of dashboards. I don't really create alerts anymore, but definitely hundreds of dashboards. And anyway, machine learning, and I've done a lot of talks on applications of machine learning to monitoring and performance analysis. So there's definitely a lot of applications there, and a lot of the vendors are working on doing some cool development around that as well. So, I've talked a lot about performance, and I know that we all have those prioritized responsibilities, right? It's not just performance. We've got all these other things that we're responsible for. And okay, yeah, that's just the truth. We have to. But definitely, of course, performance is very close to my heart, and, I think it's very important to focus on it. And so, how can you, and if you think so, and you want to change your organizations, the way they think about it, then it's really about winning hearts and minds, right? And getting people to understand performance just isn't that thing that happens at the end. It's something that we need to think about, along with all the other features, along with everything else that's important to our business and important to our customers. And so, you can act as an ambassador and think about, you need to educate, you need to enable, and you need to influence the other members of your organization. And so, I've given some talks, about this in detail, but just kind of some of the highlights. Definitely you have to keep score and understand, where are you as an organization at, right? Create those dashboards, share interesting metrics so that people understand, right? If you can tie performance into a business outcome like a conversion rate or a loan application or a report completion, then that will help make people understand why performance is important to them. And definitely make it, it's not about like shaming people, a wall of shame. I like to say, focus on process, not people. And then once you understand that, then, go after the right teams. Not every team, not every service, not every application is going to be performance critical or performance sensitive. So figure out who the right teams are for your organization, and then work with them. If they don't know where to go, and you feel like you have a good idea about how to implement performance for them, just go ahead and help get them started, whatever it takes. You can write scripts for them, you can write on some tests for them, train them on the different testing tools, or work with the vendors. I've worked with a lot of vendors. They're usually pretty happy to do some training for you to increase the usage of their tool. And focus too, not just on testing and testing and scripting and executing and then just a checkbox. Yes, okay, we did performance, but really about that the analysis and especially design. And there's some great tools out there. And then hand it off to them so they can go on their own. And then when you have successes or when you have failures, document it, right? Write up white papers or case studies, and then share it within your organization. And so, when you think about a white paper or case study, it's about telling a story. And what's cool about doing it internally, like all the vendors will give you white papers, but it may or may not be relevant to you. It will be, your own white papers and case studies will be relevant to everyone in your organization. And so, if you get one thing out of this talk, I want you to just think about performance as a feature, not performance engineering, not just as performance testing that comes at the end, but something you think about through the entire process and life cycle.
Thank you very much. Any questions? One right here. Watch your head.
Hi, thanks very much. Have you ever thought about treating performance as another resource and setting budgets for performance? Like, for instance, if a transaction is like 300 milliseconds at the P95th and you're going to do a bunch of feature work, this feature might be allowed to add 8 milliseconds to that transaction, for instance. Have you thought about that?
Yeah, that's an approach. Certainly when you have, there's different ways to approach that. So, you think about I always like to think from the customer perspective, ultimately that's what matters, right? And so they set, sort of that hard threshold of what you need to achieve. And then, within that, then you can sort of divvy up, give that budget or, have different slices of the pie and then understand sometimes, certain pieces will just, like a database call is going to be, maybe cannot get any faster, or a certain service cannot get any faster, right? And so then everything else then needs to, have some piece of that budget. And then, if you slow down, if a new feature slows something down, then you have to sort of negotiate and make something faster or improvise, or improve it. So absolutely. So that's definitely a good approach to take. And then, and when you can't make it slower, if you can't make it faster, then you can, obviously I'm very focused on performance, but there's sometimes that the user experience is not just performance. So, sometimes you can get away with, violating those budgets a little bit. Like if your design is really, really bad on your page, improving the design but making it slower might, have a net improvement business outcome. So, you definitely have to keep all of those things in mind.
Farwell.
how do you deal with third-party dependencies? For example, we have a payment processor that has to auto-scale on their side, but in their testing environment, they don't auto-scale, so our platform can't be performance tested to scale, if that makes sense, because we're large enough to at our scale to actually need like 32 containers at M5 extra large.
So I've found I've had very good success with sort of mocking or virtualization of third parties, because then you can, you're talking about in test, right? Okay, so yeah, so I would say like take a mocking or or virtualization approach, so you can then create, because usually you're usually not actually trying to test the the actual third party. But you're trying to test your code or your application, and so if you create those mocks, and you can let them scale up, and you can do some other interesting things like, well, what if that third party actually fails? And you can do some resiliency testing as well. So there's a lot of advantages to that. And I've actually done that as well. Sometimes like creating a whole end-to-end test environment is very difficult. So even virtualizing or mocking some of your own internal systems can work also. Oh, sorry.
You talked about making your systems easy to script for testing. Have you done anything particular to protect them from abuse? Because something that's easy to script is also easy to be attacked in that method.
Yeah, so what we did was we had a lot of security products, like WAFs and firewalls and such, and so those were very tight. And then what we did was then, we would schedule the tests. They weren't at random, so we knew. So we would sort of loosen the security through, keys and passwords and whitelisting, so that they would recognize, okay, this is a test, and then come through. So, when outside of the test, we were totally secure. And during the test, there was, definitely a little bit of vulnerability. But, we tried to think through, like, well, if someone is malicious in this, what will happen? And so, we tried to, stop anything really from happening. Like, okay, we would never actually ship a product to a customer or submit, a financial transaction, things like that. So, it was kind of by design, and then we had some security stuff in place. And we were also very, if we had to sacrifice anything, we would sacrifice the test. So if there was a question, kill it. Let the security do what it wanted to do and stop it. So.
Go far left wall again.
You talked about passing off the performance test duty to other people and training them. What are your top tips for how you train teams for doing analysis?
So for training teams to do analysis, so the first number one tip is train them on their own code. So what we used to do was we would train teams, and we would go into their production code, and we would do analysis on their production code before we would go to train them. And then we would come into the training, and we'd say, like, we'd use their production code, and we'd find like issues in their code. And so, so that would be the number one thing. So, don't train on, some of you have probably easy travel. If any of you in the performance space, then vendors always train on easy travel, or a lot of vendors train on easy travel, and that's okay. But train. So the number one tip would be train on your actual code and your app, so that it's hands-on and it's relevant. The other thing too is then I did a series. I kind of had like a whole syllabus or course on training of like come in. So it was like the first step was come in. Sort of like, see, here's how you can do analysis on your code in production so it's real. The next step is then, kind of step through sort of like the top use cases, how to find it, because there's all different levels of analysis you could do. Don't overload people with it. Just, start with like the top 3 use cases that you usually find, train them on that, and then give them, make sure they have access to your analysis tools before you go. So, when you finish the training, they can just start doing it. And then we would then break it up into sessions. So, like, over 2 weeks. So, like, have an hour, give them a break, then a few days later or the next week, then do another hour or two. So break it up, and then the third part was then we would go and sit with them, and actually do hands-on with them. So it was like sort of there's the initial prep, to then do the 2 spread out training sessions, and then the third session was I would send one of my engineers to go sit with the team and have them do it hands-on. So.
Okay, we got 2 up front and 1 in back, and then we'll go on a break. So go ahead, Doug.
So it seems like a lot of monitoring things are focused on ops concerns, like maybe requests per minute or latency or whatever. But the example that you used, I thought was very beneficial, where you said conversions over page load time or latency. So how do you sort of move the business and maybe the ops team or whatever, or create dashboards sort of like from a culture standpoint? How do you move the conversation from we should measure SLAs based on requests per minute or latency and say a business metric over an operational metric?
I think it's it's hard to get. It's definitely hard. You're right. It's definitely hard to get teams to sort of change that. And so, the number one thing is finding those business metrics, relating them to operational metrics that are meaningful. Like conversion rate or accounts opened or things like that, right? So find something that's very very obvious and simple, because sometimes we get like way too complex. Like a dashboard. You see dashboards with like 50 different screens and 50 different metrics, and you just don't know what it means, right? And so, start simple that everyone can understand. Tie it directly to the business, and then start reporting on it. So people get. It's kind of like. I forget, but people have to hear things, like 50 times or do things like 50 times before they start. So you just have to keep doing it, and so if you're reporting like in a weekly meeting or a service review, and people are like, oh, I really like this useless metric. Okay, report it, but then report the useful metric too. I find that too. Like, okay, well, let's think about this. Let's think about it like this, and then eventually people, and then hopefully they'll see the use of it, right? Like, oh, like I always give the example too. Like, I don't care about CPU. I don't care about CPU utilization, is because, okay, well, let's say I'm making all my sales. Customers are just converting like crazy, and my CPU is 90% utilized. Am I red? Is that a P1? Okay, let's say I'm making no sales and I have no customers on the site, and my CPU is like 5% utilized. Woohoo! Like, I've achieved my goal in life, right? No. So, kind of like even use examples, things like that, and try to make it relevant and show the use over time, and just keep doing it.
Up right here.
Hey, so I really liked how you said, you add your, test things into your Jira tickets so that testing is prioritized. So one question I have is, in some organizations, especially in the security realm, they end up having this checklist where you just kind of go through and you say yes, 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 yes. How do you kind of like prevent this? So I agree with you that the agile way to put it in cards is the right way to kind of push it through so that people are actually testing. But how do you prevent like management from saying, hey, these things are in every card, we should make it a checklist, and then everybody kind of forgets about it?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I remember even working with a developer, and she was like, oh, I've completed all your paperwork for you. It's just like paperwork and testing. And I think, you have to have the tools, so do it. And I think that's, it's about just continually providing, showing the value, demonstrating the value, right? So that it becomes, obvious. It's like putting your seatbelt on, yeah, you have to put your seatbelt on every single time. It's like I tell my kids, put your seatbelt on every single time. And then, sometimes they don't, but then the car jerks, and then the seatbelt, triggers, and they're like, oh, okay, now I know it. Now I know, and then they're always put their seatbelt on, or something like that. And so, hopefully, you keep delivering the message. Deliver the message, and then hopefully the value is seen over time. Right, and so I always find that teams that have had a major performance issue are really enthusiastic about performance, right? So reactive is always good. I mean, people are always successful reactively in that sense, right? Like proactive is more challenging. You just have to keep at it. Do some of the things, like tell stories about like, oh, well, this team had this problem, and we say, remember, we had this problem on Cyber Monday or that big sale or whatever. Just keep conveying the message, showing the value.
And just like 1 minute for the one last question in the back there.
When should you optimize for performance?
When, always, yeah. Is that your question?
Yeah, so there's kind of a thing that you shouldn't pre-optimize if you don't need to. When should you optimize for performance?
Yeah, so, I mean, you're right. Like, tell a joke story. Like, one of the companies I worked at, we were implementing a new feature. Like you could initiate a return online. Like say I want to return it, and I was like, and so we tested it, and it was really slow, and I was like, well, that's good, right? Like, but but really, like you want to look at the you want to keep in mind what the business relevance is. I would say, right? So do you need to optimize your where your store location page, where your store locations are? It's probably not really critical. So I would not spend a lot of resources and time optimizing stuff that isn't very sensitive to performance, right? So I think that would be sort of my initial sort of general answer is when something is very important, and very sensitive to performance, then you definitely should optimize. If not, don't, because you have better things to do. So performance, it always matters in certain critical areas, and it may not matter in some other areas. So don't worry about those.
One more hand for Gopal, please.
Thank you.